You ever notice how silence in the woods can shift? One moment it's peaceful. The next, it's like the trees are holding their breath. That's exactly what Harold Jacobs described in his final phone call, made at 7:42 p.m. on October 17th, 1993. We've arrived safe. But the forest feels off, too quiet. That was the last anyone ever heard from him or his family. 3 days later, their mountain cabin was found torn open like a paper toy. No claw marks, no footprints, just blood on the floorboards, and one unanswered question. What the hell came through those woods? I spent 6 months digging through sealed case files, unreleased forensic audio, and a single voicemail that made veteran detectives go silent. What happened at Timberlake Cabin wasn't just hidden, it was buried. In this video, you'll uncover why the case was locked away for over 30 years. A voice captured on tape that didn't match any of the victims, and why none of the original investigators ever returned to the site. Because here's the thing. Police found 4 bodies, but one voice on the recording whispered their names while we're still inside. If you think this is just another ghost story, stop now. What I'm about to play hasn't been explained to this day, and once you hear it, you'll understand why survivors say, if it starts mimicking your voice, it's already too late. They arrived just before sundown, tires crunching over the gravel road that seemed to vanish into the woods behind them. October air in the Georgia mountains carries a kind of stillness you don't question, unless it's your first time hearing it, and for the Jacobs family, it was. The forest around Timberlake Cabin didn't welcome them. It accepted them, the way a trap accepts its prey. Harold stepped out first, stretching his legs from the long drive, while Denise helped Megan and Alex grab their backpacks. They moved with the rhythm of routine, unloading groceries, stacking firewood, checking the water line. A normal family on a not-so-normal weekend. The plan was simple. 3 days of hiking, games, and stars. No screens, no neighbors. Just the kind of solitude they thought would reset something that had quietly frayed in their lives. But the forest didn't stay quiet. It watched. Inside, the cabin creaked under the shifting temperatures of late fall. Built decades earlier and passed from owner to owner, Timberlake had a history, people whispered of Bob. But never directly. No one stayed more than a few months. The last owner left under personal reasons and refused to ever discuss it again. Denise found that odd, but chalked it up to mountain superstition. After all, the place looked peaceful, like something off a postcard. That first night passed uneventfully. The family ate chili, played cards, and fell asleep to the soft static of the wind brushing pine needles. But the next morning, Harold noticed something strange. Nothing dramatic, just off. The birds, there weren't any. Not even crows. For miles around the ridge, not a single chirp. Only the low rustling of leaves and the faraway groan of branches under their own weight. But when Harold called the office later that evening to check in, he couldn't shake the edge in his voice. Megan made a crown of red leaves. Alex whittled a stick into what he claimed was a dagger. But something about the land felt uninhabited. Not abandoned, empty, like everything that should be there had left in a hurry. On the morning of the 3rd day, Harold found the tracks. Behind the woodshed, in soft earth, just where the trees start to thicken. One clear print, 16 inches, long and deep, pressed down like something heavy had stood still for a moment. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. No claw tips, no heel curve. Just 5 blunt digits and an arch that ended too high. He didn't tell Denise, because something came back to Timberlake Cabin. And this time, it didn't stay outside. They got there just before the lights slipped behind the trees. The road had narrowed for the last 2 miles, until it wasn't really a road at all. Just gravel folding into dark pines. The SUV's tires crunched over stones like brittle bones. The branches crowding overhead. And when the cabin finally emerged, it felt less like a rival, and more like the forest had allowed them in. Timberlake Cabin wasn't much to look at. Single story, rough-hewn logs, moss-blackened roof. But it had history. A retirement dream left to rot in mystery. And now for Harold and Denise Jacobs, It was a chance at something simple, something disconnected. A weekend off-grid. 3 days with their kids. Alex and Megan without phones, without distractions. Just crisp October air, starry skies, and each other. The first thing Harold noticed was the stillness. Not just quiet, but a hush so absolute it felt staged. No birds, no bugs, not even the soft hum of forest life that usually hums below consciousness. Just wind brushing through hollow space. But he said nothing, not yet. That evening, they unpacked, made dinner, and lit a small fire in the pit out back. The kids roasted marshmallows, chasing sparks with cold fingers, while Denise snapped Polaroids of Megan wearing a crown of red oak leaves. For a while, it felt idyllic. Too idyllic. But there was something under the surface, like the forest was holding its breath. The second day was more active. They hiked along Pine and Hollow Trail, following rusted trail markers and crunching through leaves so deep they swallowed their steps. They saw deer, heard distant rustling, laughed, but the quiet never left. It clung to the corners of every moment. And at night, when the wind rose and the fire burned low, Harold kept glancing out the cabin window, like he expected to see something standing there. Then came Sunday morning. The air was colder, the sky sharp with white light. Harold walked behind the cabin to check the woodshed, and that's when he saw it. A footprint, huge. The ground was soft from rain, and the impression was deep. Whatever made it was heavy and still. He didn't tell Denise. Didn't want to alarm her. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe a boot print warped by mud. But as he stood there, staring at it, the woods around him seemed to lean in. A sudden gust of wind broke the branches above, scattering pine needles, and for just a second, he swore he heard something move beyond the tree line. Not walking, breathing. That evening, around 7:30, Denise used the emergency radio to contact her sister in Atlanta. Caroline never picked up, but her answering machine recorded everything, and what it captured wasn't just fear. It was something else, something older, something that had been circling the cabin for 2 days, waiting, because what they didn't realize was that Timberlake cabin hadn't been abandoned. It had been left behind. By Tuesday morning, they were missing. By Wednesday, they were presumed dead. But it would take until sunrise that day, 48 hours after the last transmission, for someone to reach Timberlake cabin. Deputy Elliot Thornberry was the first one on scene. The road was half washed out from a storm, and the last mile had to be walked in, boots soaked through frost and mud. He approached slowly, hand resting on his sidearm, though even then, he said later, "I knew I was too late." You could feel it in the air, like whatever had happened wasn't gone. The cabin door didn't swing open. It was gone, torn from the frame, solid oak, splintered at the hinges. The frame buckled inward like something had pushed through it, not into it. Inside, it was worse. Broken chairs, overturned bookshelves, shattered dishes, but not in a random way. It looked directed, focused. Harold's body was found first, in the kitchen. Head crushed by a single blow so forceful that bone fragments embedded into the wood grain of the pantry door behind him. Denise was in the hallway between the main room and the back bedrooms. Her spine was fractured in 3 places, trauma consistent with being thrown, hard, against a vertical surface. The children were last. Alex had crawled under the bed, as if to hide. Megan was found near the window, one shoe off, hand reaching toward the latch. Both showed no signs of slicing or claw damage, no tearing, just blunt force trauma, enough to kill instantly. But here's the part that chills you. There were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just the overwhelming, grotesque suggestion that it all happened fast. Forensics estimated the attack lasted under 5 minutes, and the strangest part, there were no claw marks anywhere. Not on the walls, not on the furniture, nothing that suggested an animal attack, despite what would come later in the official report. The destruction was surgical, clean, violent, but not feral, not messy. It wasn't until the coroner noted something that the story took a darker turn. A smear of fluid, found on the edge of the doorframe, had an odor no one could place. Rank, Sweet. Wrong. Samples were taken, but the test results were never made public. They vanished. And then came the call. Because Caroline Westfield had handed over her answering machine to the police. The one Denise had spoken into. The recording had been partially overwritten, but not all of it. And what survived? A voice. Denise's. Frantic. Whispering. It's outside. It's big. I think it's circling. God, it's on the porch now. Then silence. Then a second voice. Softer. Mimicking Denise. But in that static, forensic audio analysts later detected what they believed to be a vocalization. Not a roar. Not a growl. It sounded like breathing. Measured. Close. And that was the moment the official story began to collapse under its own weight. Because if it was an animal, it knew how to imitate human speech. Or worse, it didn't need to. It already sounded like one of us. But that's not even the part that keeps me up. Because 3 days later, an old man came forward with the story no one wanted to believe. And what he saw changed everything. 3 days after the bodies were found, with the town still caught in a fog of disbelief, and the media beginning to sniff around the edges, a man named Burt Mallister walked into the sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone, privately. 76 years old, lived alone on a tract of land about a mile southeast of Timberlake, retired carpenter, part-time beekeeper, and the kind of man the locals described as quiet but sharp, no history of paranoia, no drinking problem, no reason to lie. Mallister said he'd seen something in the days before the Jacobs family was found, something he couldn't explain. It started the Friday before, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the sky turned that cold blue. He'd been walking his property line, checking on a section of broken fencing, when he saw movement through the trees. Not an animal. Not exactly. It moved too fluid, too deliberately. Tall. Upright. He said it was built like a man, but hunched, covered in tangled black hair, with limbs too long for a human silhouette. It moved silently between the trees, watching him, keeping pace for nearly 100 yards. Then it vanished. No noise. No trail. No trail. He didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe him? But after hearing about the Jacobs family, the details, the unnatural force, the crushed bodies, the missing time, he couldn't stay silent. He gave a full statement, drew a sketch, even led a deputy to the area where he'd seen it. And that's where the official response turned cold. Mallister's report was quietly filed, then disregarded. The sheriff told the press it was an unfortunate bear attack, and nothing more. No mention of Mallister, no mention of what he'd seen. But here's the thing. The sketch he handed in, the one folded neatly into the case file before it disappeared, it matched, almost line for line. It matched descriptions from other sightings across the Appalachian Trail, from hikers in West Virginia, campers in North Carolina, all of them describing a thing they couldn't name. Something almost human. And what if I told you? Burt Mallister didn't stick around much longer. He sold his property within 6 months, moved to Florida, no forwarding address, no phone number. He never spoke publicly again. But years later, after his death, in 2007, his niece found a journal tucked behind a false wall in his old workshop. Inside were sketches, pages and pages of the same figure, always half in shadow, always near trees. One entry read in uneven handwriting, "It's not an animal. It doesn't hunt. It clears space. When it walks, the woods listen." And then this, scrawled at the bottom, almost like an afterthought, "Just the loudest." That was the moment I realized this story doesn't begin with the Jacobs family. And it doesn't end with them either. After the Jacobs case was quietly closed, Timberlake cabin was demolished. They didn't try to sell it. They didn't mark it off for investigation. They brought in a crew and leveled it by spring. Not even a chimney left standing. Like the place had become a wound too raw to leave exposed. Realtors stopped showing property along Black Hollow Ridge. Some even warned clients, off the record, to steer clear. Not worth the view, they'd say. Years later, a team of wildlife researchers hiking along the old Pine Hollow Trail noticed something strange. Not a sight, but an absence. No squirrels, no bird calls, no tracks in fresh snow, just a blanket of stillness, stretching exactly 1 mile around where the cabin used to stand. As if even the animals knew to stay out. But one of them wandered too close. A junior biologist, collecting moss samples, veered just a few yards off trail. He returned pale, shaking, mumbling something about a smell like wet stone and meat, and seeing a shape that shouldn't stand like that. When they pressed him, he clammed up, left the program within weeks, moved back to Arizona. Wouldn't speak of it again. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this was an isolated incident. A decade earlier, 2 hikers vanished just north of Timberlake. No trace, same area, same pattern. And before that, a family in 1981, never reported. Locals remembered the name, but not the story. It was always the same. Newcomers, remote cabin, then silence. But it wasn't just the pattern. It was what was missing, because when I finally got access to the archived forensic photos, ones that should have been destroyed, I noticed something the reports never mentioned. The scratch marks on the interior beams. Not claw marks, not tools. Long, wide streaks across the wood, like fingers, but not human fingers. Too long, too narrow, and always positioned the same way. Facing in, like something had braced itself before it lunged. And that's when I went back to the audio file. The call Denise made. I cleaned the file, ran it through software to isolate frequencies. And under the static, right after her scream, just before the wood breaks, there's a sound, not a voice. A clicking, rhythmic, like wet joints or bones. That sound matches exactly with one found in a 2003 recording from a Sasquatch researcher in Oregon. Except in that case, it came from 400 yards away. This was inside the room. So here's the question that haunts me. What if this thing doesn't just hunt? What if it chooses, waits, studies, returns? And what if the Jacobs weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the next place on the list? Because the more I trace these stories, the footprints, the mimicry, the silence, the more I'm convinced of one thing. Whatever was in those woods didn't leave. It just stepped back into the trees. And it's still listening. I've stood at the edge of that clearing, the place where Timberlake cabin used to be. Nothing remains now. No ruins, no foundation, not even the outline in the soil. Just a ring of trees that grow too straight, too still. It's not marked on any hiking maps, and the GPS signal gets jittery when you get close. But when you're there, you feel it. That absence. Like you've stepped into a breath that's been held too long. Like the woods are waiting for something. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Not the footprints. Not the voices. Not even the crushing, impossible violence. But the waiting. Because whatever happened to the Jacobs family wasn't random. It wasn't a predator looking for food. It was something older. Something intelligent. Something that let them settle in. Watch them play with their kids. Let them roast marshmallows and tuck into sleeping bags before it chose to step in. And when it did, it didn't hesitate. I keep thinking about what Denise said on that recording. How she could smell it through the window. Hear it breathing. And then, that voice, soft, calm, identical to her own, calling her name from outside. Not to scare her, but to invite her. That's what makes this different from any cryptid encounter I've ever investigated. This wasn't a creature caught off guard. This was a presence that knew how to approach, how to speak, how to wait. So what was it? A Dogman? A shadow variant of Sasquatch? Or something even older? Something that mimics the living to lure them out? I don't have answers, but I do have this. Every few months I get new messages from hikers, from backwoods campers, from families who swear they heard their own voices echoing from just beyond the trees. Always at dusk. Always with that same silence swallowing the air. And if you've been in the Blue Ridge Mountains, near Black Hollow Ridge, and felt something watching, something that made the forest go quiet like the animals knew, I want to hear from you. Because this story isn't over, and maybe it never was. In the deepest parts of the wilderness, silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's a presence, A presence that reminds us how small we are, how fragile our place really is beneath the canopy of time, nature, and things older than understanding. Out there, far from streetlights and cell towers, the world doesn't follow our rules. There are no fences to hold back the old stories, no logic to explain what flickers just beyond the tree line. What we often call monsters may not be monsters at all, but echoes of something we've forgotten. Reminders that humanity didn't rise alone, that our dominion was never absolute, that before we mapped the earth, we feared it, revered it, whispered to it in languages long buried beneath concrete and signal. Maybe those whispers were a kind of respect, a kind of prayer, and maybe the silence that comes before something steps out of the dark is the answer. Because some truths aren't loud. They don't scream. They wait. They watch. And they ask, what do you really believe when you're the only heartbeat left in the woods? In the end, what matters isn't whether every story is real, but whether we still listen, whether we're willing to admit there are corners of this world that remain untouched, unclaimed, untamed, and whether we're humble enough to let them be. These stories, at their core, remind us not just of what might be out there, but of who we are in the face of the unknown. Not conquerors, not explorers. Just people. Quiet, blinking, standing at the edge of something we can't quite name. So maybe the next time you feel the hairs on your neck rise in a forest gone still, don't run, don't follow. Just remember, some places want to be left alone. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story moved you, made you think, or chilled you just a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're drawn to tales of the strange, the hidden, and the unexplained, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell so you don't miss what's waiting in the next clearing. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and never ignore the silence.